The Swift farm was located half an hour's drive from Austin, Texas. It was here, among endless fields and pastures, that Carla Swift, later known as Carla Evergreen, grew up. From childhood, she was surrounded by the smells of freshly cut grass, warm milk, and sun-warmed wood from the old barn. When Carla was 10, her parents were killed in a car accident on the highway while returning from an agricultural fair in Dallas. Her grandfather, Ebenezer Swift, who was already a widower at the time, took custody of his granddaughter. He taught her everything she knew about life and work on a farm. Ebenezer was a man of the old school, quiet, stubborn, and incredibly hard-working. "If you want something done right, do it yourself," he liked to say, methodically checking every little thing on the farm. Even when he hired workers, he didn't allow himself to relax, always keeping his finger on the pulse of all the processes. Carla quickly adopted his approach to work. By the age of 15, she knew all the ins and outs of dairy production, could repair almost any piece of equipment, and could tell at a glance whether a cow was healthy. Local farmers, who at first laughed at the girl-playing house, eventually came to respect her. The Swift farm was famous for its milk. Their small but strong herd of Holstein Friesian cows produced excellent milk yields. Ebenezer always said that the secret to good milk was simple: happy cows and clean facilities. Carla learned this lesson well, as did many others. At school, she was not a teacher's pet or a prom queen. Her hands, accustomed to hard work, were not good at applying makeup, and for a long time, the only perfume she wore was the scent of hay and summer wind. But Carla never suffered from this. She genuinely enjoyed working on the farm. After school, she could have gone to college. Her grandfather had saved money for her education. But Carla decided to stay. "Why do I need a degree?" she would say to her friends. "I already have a profession and a life's work." Ebenezer did not comment on her decision, only hugged his granddaughter more tightly. By the age of 40, Carla had become the true mistress of the farm. She knew the value of hard work and was able to make difficult decisions. Like her grandfather, she had an unyielding but not harsh character. The workers respected her for her fairness and her ability to take on any task herself. Outwardly, she bore little resemblance to the typical Texas farmer's wife in advertising brochures. She was tall, wiry, perpetually tanned, and quick and confident in her movements. She wore her hair short so it wouldn't get in the way of her work. She wore jeans and plaid shirts because they were comfortable. No makeup. There was no time to put on makeup when she had to get up at 5 in the morning. The farm was her life, her passion, and her future. Every morning, stepping out onto the porch of the old house, she breathed in the scent of dew and felt completely happy. This was her world. Understandable, right? And honest. She knew every corner of this land, remembered the name of every cow in the herd, and was sure she would live here until the end of her days. Carla never wanted to get married. "If I find the right man, fine. If not, I'll live like this," she would say to her few friends when they tried to set her up with yet another nice guy. She didn't believe in the romance of love stories, preferring simple and straightforward things. That's how she was until she met Colin Evergreen, a woman who was sure of herself and knew exactly what she wanted out of life. Nothing foreshadowed the coming changes in her measured life. But fate, as we know, loves to throw surprises even at those who don't need them. Colin Evergreen showed up at the Swift farm in the middle of spring. He arrived in a brand-new blue Ford with a dairy company logo on the door, dressed in a pressed suit, completely out of place in these parts. Carla was just finishing checking the cooling system in the dairy when he entered, trying not to get his polished shoes dirty. The Texas dairy products representative looked like someone who had never seen a real farm in his life. He shifted uneasily from foot to foot, clearly afraid of getting his pants dirty, and glanced warily at the workers passing by. Carla couldn't help smiling at his bewilderment. "Miss Swift?" He held out his hand to her, but quickly withdrew it when he noticed the traces of machine oil on her palms. "Just Carla," she replied, wiping her hands on a rag. Colin began to talk about the advantages of working with their company, but kept getting sidetracked by the sounds of machinery and the mooing of cows. Ebenezer heard the noise and came out of his office. He listened silently to the young man's proposal, asked a few precise questions about prices and contract terms, and then unexpectedly invited him to stay for lunch. "You can't do business on an empty stomach," he said. Over lunch, Colin gradually relaxed. It turned out that he had grown up in the suburbs of Houston in a family of school teachers. He had come to the dairy business by chance. A friend had suggested he try his hand at sales. "I thought it would be easy, driving around to stores, offering milk, but it turned out you had to understand the whole production process," he admitted. Carla noticed that beneath the formal exterior was a rather interesting conversationalist. Colin was a good listener and asked the right questions. He was genuinely interested in the milk production process, and Carla, without expecting it, gave him a short tour of the farm. "And this is our pride and joy, Betsy," Carla said, leading him to a pen where a large black and white cow was grazing. "She's the best milk producer in the county." Colin cautiously reached out his hand to the animal's muzzle, and Betsy nudged his palm with her wet nose in a friendly manner. "She recognizes you," Carla smiled. "And you?" Colin asked unexpectedly, looking into her eyes. Their first date took place a week after the contract was signed. Colin brought the documents and casually invited Carla to dinner in town. She agreed, surprising herself with her decision. They talked at the restaurant until closing time. It turned out they had a lot to talk about besides work. Colin came to the farm more often than his work required. Sometimes he just sat in the office watching Carla go about her business. "You're like a conductor," he said once. "You're in charge of this complex orchestra, and everything follows your rhythm." Carla just waved it off, but she liked the comparison. Ebenezer silently watched their relationship develop. One evening, he called his granddaughter into his office. "He's a city boy," her grandfather said, lighting his pipe. "Someone who grew up on asphalt will never understand the land." Carla said nothing, but she thought to herself that her grandfather might be right. However, Colin seemed to be sincerely trying to understand their world. Colin proposed 6 months after they met. Without pomp or excessive romance, he simply asked her over dinner if she would marry him. Carla agreed just as easily. Neither of them was inclined toward grand gestures or lavish ceremonies. The wedding was modest, attended only by close friends and family. Colin insisted that the ceremony take place on the farm, which earned him Ebenezer's approval. Carla wore a simple white dress and added wildflowers picked that morning in the pasture to her bouquet. After the wedding, they settled in the Swift house. Carla couldn't leave the farm, and Colin didn't seem to mind. He continued to work as a sales representative, now as a regional manager. His career was on the rise. The company valued his ability to find common ground with farmers. At first, their marriage seemed like a perfect union. Colin brought a breath of fresh air to the farm's measured life, new ideas for business development, connections in the city, and a modern approach to management. Carla remained a reliable anchor, keeping the farm afloat. In the evenings, they often sat on the porch discussing the day's events. Colin talked about city news, company plans, and new technologies in dairy production. Carla shared the farm's successes, problems with equipment, and stories about the workers and animals. Ebenezer sometimes joined them, silently puffing on his pipe and occasionally interjecting with apt remarks. A year after the wedding, they began to talk about expanding production. Colin suggested taking out a loan and modernizing the equipment, but Ebenezer was against it. "You can't risk what has been built up over generations," he said. Carla was torn between her husband and her grandfather, understanding that both were right. The farm workers were wary of Colin. To them, he remained an outsider, a city slicker who spoke the right words but had no feel for the land. However, this did not seem to bother him. He spent most of his time traveling on company business. By the end of their second year of marriage, Carla began to notice that Colin was staying in the city more and more often. His stories about work became shorter, and his ability to find common ground with the farmers no longer seemed so sincere. But she chalked it up to fatigue and work problems. Everyone goes through difficult periods. Ebenezer watched all this with concern. "Look closer, girl," he would say to his granddaughter. "City air changes people." But Carla didn't want to listen. She was sure that she and Colin were bound by something more than just a marriage of convenience, a common cause, common plans, a common future. The farm continued to live its life, measured and predictable. The cows gave milk, the workers did their duties, the equipment broke down and was repaired. Carla threw herself into her work, trying not to notice how her husband was gradually changing. Or maybe he wasn't changing at all. Maybe he was just becoming himself, shedding the mask that had once helped him win the heart of the Swift farm's mistress. Chapter 3. Cracks. In the first years after the wedding, life on the Swift farm ran smoothly. Colin really tried to become part of this world. He didn't shy away from dirty work, knew how to get along with machinery, and wasn't afraid of physical labor. One night, when their best cow went into difficult labor, he spent several hours in the barn with Carla and the veterinarian, helping to deliver the calf. The next day, covered in mud and sleep-deprived, he still went to an important meeting in town. Ebenezer, who was initially wary of his son-in-law, gradually began to warm up to him. He was particularly impressed by how Colin single-handedly rebuilt the engine of his Ford right in the farmyard. "A man who can work with his hands can't be a complete failure," the old man remarked after that incident. But gradually, so slowly that no one noticed at first, something began to change. Perhaps it was the frequent business trips. Colin was traveling more and more often to large cities on company business. Perhaps it was because his career was taking off, and he was spending more and more time in offices rather than on farms. Or maybe it was just that his initial enthusiasm was beginning to fade, as is often the case. At first, he stopped tinkering with the car himself and took it to a garage for servicing. "I just don't have time," he explained to Carla. Then he began to miss family dinners more and more often, staying out late in the city. His stories about work became increasingly vague, but he talked more and more about social events, new restaurants, and city life. Carla noticed that her husband had started dressing differently. His plaid shirts and old jeans disappeared, replaced by expensive suits and fashionable shoes. He started wearing perfume, a subtle French scent that seemed out of place among the smells of the farm. Even his speech changed. He started using new words, acquiring an urban polish and a slight snobbery toward country life. One evening he came home particularly late, smelling of expensive whiskey. "You know," he said to Carla, "I was at a presentation at the Hilton today. There were people from Europe there. You should see how they live. And here we are, among manure and hay." Carla said nothing, but his words hurt her deeply. Colin appeared less and less in the farm buildings, preferring to spend his time in the office. When equipment broke down, he was no longer in a hurry to help with repairs. He called mechanics from the city. "We can afford it," he said. "It's not about the money," Carla replied, but he no longer understood what she meant. In the 5th year of their marriage, a drought struck. The farm managed to cope. The Swifts always had feed reserves and a good irrigation system. But Colin began to talk about selling some of the land. "It's irrational to keep so much pasture. We could invest the money in securities, it's safer." Ebenezer, overhearing this conversation, just shook his head. Carla noticed how her husband wrinkled his nose at the smell of silage, how he shook his boots disdainfully when he came out of the cowshed, how he got annoyed when the workers turned to him for decisions on various matters. He spoke more and more often about the need to modernize the farm, to make it more up-to-date. A condescending tone crept into his voice when he told his city partners about our family business. In the evenings, they rarely sat together on the porch anymore. Colin preferred to spend his time in his office at the computer, studying stock reports or corresponding with business partners. If Carla brought up farm business, he nodded absently, clearly thinking about something else. The farm workers had long noticed these changes. Our Mr. Evergreen has become quite the city slicker, they said among themselves. Colin no longer participated in communal meals, preferring to eat alone or in town. He stopped shaking hands with the mechanics and cowboys, now limiting himself to a brief nod. Ebenezer watched what was happening with concern. His initial approval had turned to suspicion. "You can't trust a man who is ashamed of honest work," he said to his granddaughter one day. Carla defended her husband, talking about stress and fatigue, but deep down she knew her grandfather was right. His wardrobe was filled with designer clothes. He now preferred expensive restaurants to simple eateries, and conversations about livestock and milk yields were increasingly replaced by discussions of stock prices and new business opportunities. The farm seemed to have become an annoying necessity for him, a reminder of the past he was trying to leave behind. Once, during a family dinner, he began to talk about his recent trip to Paris. "That's real life," he said enthusiastically. "Culture, art, fine cuisine. Not this endless digging in the dirt." Ebenezer silently rose from the table and left. Carla looked at her husband and did not recognize the dapper, self-satisfied man who had once been the Colin she had fallen in love with. In his absence, the farm seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The workers no longer strained to meet his new standards. Carla could go about her business without listening to constant suggestions about restructuring and optimization. Even the cows seemed calmer when their master was away. Barbara Zinna arrived in Austin in the spring when the city was in full bloom. She came on a cultural exchange program, ostensibly to study the American experience of organizing farmers' markets. Tall, slender, with a mane of reddish hair and a slight French accent, she immediately attracted the attention of the local business community. Her first encounter with Colin took place at a business dinner organized by the Chamber of Commerce. Barbara sat 2 seats away from him, talking about French farms and how beautiful Provence was. Colin couldn't take his eyes off her. She seemed to embody the life he had recently begun to dream of. Barbara talked about her family, about the winery near Bordeaux, the small chateau surrounded by vineyards, the dinner parties and social gatherings. In her stories, even working on a farm seemed different, more elegant perhaps. "We call it agritourism," she said, drawing out the words dramatically. "People pay a lot of money to see how wine is made." After dinner, Colin offered to drive her back to her hotel. On the way, they talked about the differences between the European and American approaches to agriculture. Barbara spoke condescendingly about Texas farms. Too rough, too primitive. Colin found himself nodding in agreement. The next day, he accidentally ran into her at a cafe near the dairy company's office. Barbara was sitting at a table by the window, elegantly stirring her coffee with a spoon. Her silk blouse and pearl earrings seemed out of place in a simple cafe, but that was what attracted attention. They began to meet at business events. Barbara had a knack for showing up wherever Colin was. "Oh, what a coincidence!" she exclaimed, batting her long eyelashes. Gradually, these encounters became more frequent and less casual. Colin found new reasons to stay in town. Barbara was a good listener, or at least she was good at creating the illusion of being an attentive listener. She nodded sympathetically when Colin complained about country life, the smell of manure and early mornings. "Monsieur Colin," she would say, "you deserve better. A man of your refinement shouldn't be wasting away in the Texas wilderness. In conversations with her, Colin increasingly found himself embellishing his role in the business. The Swift farm became a large agribusiness in his stories, and he was no longer just a sales representative, but a regional development director. Barbara seemed to live in a different world, a world of expensive restaurants, fashion shows, and social gatherings. She could talk for hours about Parisian boutiques, wine tastings, and how wonderful life was in Europe. Her stories captivated Colin, making him forget about reality. She always showed up at business meetings in new outfits from famous designers. "Oh, this? Just a little dress from Chanel," she would say casually. Colin began to notice how provincial his own wardrobe looked. Soon he bought several expensive suits. Barbara loved to talk about culture and art, although her knowledge in these areas was rather superficial. She could confuse Monet and Manet, but she pronounced their names with such a charming accent that it didn't seem to matter. Colin began buying art books and opera tickets. In her presence, he tried to speak differently, choosing more sophisticated words and attempting to imitate a refined tone. Barbara encouraged these efforts, calling him "so European." She taught him how to hold a wine glass properly and distinguish between different types of cheese. "You see," she said, "you've always had this refinement." Her apartment in downtown Austin was tastefully furnished, which seemed to Colin the height of sophistication. Antique furniture, actually cheap fakes, reproductions of impressionist paintings on the walls, the subtle scent of French perfume. All of this created the illusion of the life he had begun to dream of. Gradually, their meetings became more personal. They dined in secluded restaurants, strolled through quiet streets, and talked about the future. Barbara knew how to listen to his dreams and fuel them with her fantasies about life in Paris. "Imagine," she would say, "a little café in Montmartre, croissant in the morning, walks along the Seine." In her stories, France appeared to be a country of eternal celebration and refined pleasures. She didn't mention that her family chateau was just an old farmhouse and her winery was a small plot of land with a few rows of grapevines. But Colin didn't bother to check her stories. They fit his dreams too well. Barbara never asked about Carla. If Colin mentioned his wife, she deftly changed the subject. There was no place in her world for a simple farmer's wife, as she mentally referred to Carla. However, Colin himself thought less and less about home, preferring to immerse himself in the illusory world of French chic. She knew how to make everything seem accidental, chance encounters, casual touches, random compliments. But behind this apparent spontaneity lay a clear calculation. Barbara saw Colin as her ticket to a better life and methodically led him to a decision that would change both of them. Ebenezer Swift began to give in imperceptibly. At first, he started waking up a little later than usual. Then he stopped checking the distant pens himself, entrusting this task to his workers. His gait, always firm and confident, became slightly slower. But his character remained the same. He still checked reports meticulously, gave precise advice, and could sit in his office for hours planning the farm's work. Carla noticed these changes but tried not to show it. She simply began to visit her grandfather more often, bringing him documents to sign and asking his advice on minor matters, not because she needed advice but to make him feel needed. Ebenezer understood this but accepted his granddaughter's concern with the same silent dignity with which he had done everything in his life. He was respected by all the farm workers, from old Jim, who had worked there since Carla's parents' time, to the young guys who had recently joined the farm. When Ebenezer appeared in the cowshed or at the silo pits, the work seemed to start running more smoothly and efficiently. It wasn't because he demanded or gave orders. It was simply that no one wanted to let the old man down. At 92, he still remembered the history of every piece of land on the farm. "Right here," he would say, pointing to the northern pasture. is where your great-grandfather dug the first furrow. And over there, by the stream, your father and I dug the first well. For him, the farm was not just land and buildings. It was his family's history, imprinted in every stone and every tree. When he fell ill, it happened suddenly. One morning he didn't come down for breakfast, and when Carla looked in on him, she found him in bed, pale but calm. "I guess it's time for me to rest a little," he said with his usual faint smile. Carla called the doctor, but deep down she already knew that her grandfather was simply tired of living. He never complained of pain, although the doctors said it must have been severe. He continued to take an interest in the farm, asking for reports and summaries of the day's work to be brought to him. Even in bed, he remained the same Ebenezer Swift, a man who was used to keeping everything under control. The workers came to visit him, one by one, shyly shifting from foot to foot by the bed. He found the right words for each of them, praise where it was due, a scolding where necessary, advice when needed. And each left with the feeling that the old master was still watching over the farm, still making sure that everything was going right. Carla spent all her free time with him. Sometimes they just sat in silence. They didn't need words to understand each other. Sometimes Grandpa told stories from the past, about how they survived the drought in the 60s, how they fought off the bank trying to take their land, how happy they were when they got their first tractor. His stories brought to life not only the history of their family, but of all Texas farming. Colin rarely appeared in his grandfather's room. He claimed to be busy, to have important meetings, but Carla could see that he simply felt uncomfortable around a dying man. Ebenezer made no comment on his son-in-law's absence, only occasionally glancing at his granddaughter as if he wanted to say something but held back. A week before his death, he called Carla to him and talked to her at length about the farm. Not about milk yields and profits, but about the soul of the place, about responsibility to the land and the people who worked it. "Remember, girl," he said, "a farm isn't just a business. It's a living thing, and it feels care and betrayal." Carla nodded, swallowing her tears. In his last days, he often lapsed into unconsciousness, but even then he continued to worry about his affairs. "Check the south pen," he muttered in his sleep. "The fence is weak there." Carla checked. Sure enough, the posts were starting to rot. Even in death, her grandfather remained the master of the farm. He passed away quietly, in his sleep. He simply didn't wake up one morning when the first rays of sunlight began to peek through the curtains. His face was peaceful. It looked as if he had just dozed off, thinking about his latest plan to improve the farm. The news of his death spread around the farm in an instant. The workers gathered at the house, standing silently with their hats off. Old Jim cried, not ashamed of his tears. Even the cows seemed to sense something that day. The milk yield was lower than usual. Carla held herself together. She organized the funeral, accepted condolences, and made sure that work on the farm continued. Her grandfather would not have approved of any downtime. Only at night, alone in her room, did she allow herself to cry, remembering everything he had taught her. Ebenezer Swift had lived a long life and died as dignified as he had lived, never giving up, never complaining, caring about his life's work until the very end. He left behind not only a strong farm, but also the memory of a man who never betrayed his principles. Everything in his office remained as it was: the old leather chair, the worn desk, the account books he kept himself. Carla couldn't bring herself to change anything. It seemed as if the spirit of Ebenezer Swift was still present, still protecting the farm and its inhabitants. It was a clear, quiet day, one of those autumn days when the sky seems especially high and the air rings with transparent purity. St. Michael's, the small Methodist church where Ebenezer had been baptized 80 years ago, could barely hold all those who had come to say goodbye. Carla greeted people at the entrance. She stood straight, composed in a simple black dress, and found the right words for everyone. The farm workers came with their families, wives in dark dresses, children quiet and unusually well behaved. Old Jim limped up the steps and silently embraced her. His embrace offered more support than any words of condolence could have. Colin stood slightly apart as if acting as master of ceremonies, but Carla noticed his impatient glances at his watch. His new black suit seemed out of place in a rural church. He kept checking his phone, even though Carla had asked everyone to turn them off. The front rows were occupied by farm workers and their families, an unspoken hierarchy that everyone understood and accepted. Behind them sat neighboring farmers, local business people, all those who knew and respected Ebenezer Swift. The pastor, Reverend Anderson, began the service, his soft voice sounding calm and confident. She appeared just as the Reverend was talking about Ebenezer's life. The creak of the heavy oak door made everyone turn around. Barbara Zinna entered the church in a snow-white wedding dress with a long train, a thin veil, and a bouquet of white lilies in her hands. For a second, there was absolute silence. Then a collective sigh swept through the church, a mixture of indignation, shock, and disbelief. Barbara, seemingly oblivious to the reaction, walked down the center aisle, her heels clicking on the old floorboards. Her appearance was calculated down to the last detail, from her perfect hairstyle to the slight smile playing on her painted lips. Mrs. Johnson, the senior mechanic's wife, gasped loudly and crossed herself. One of the women cursed softly, the sound echoing clearly under the church vaults. The children stared open-mouthed at the bride until their mothers turned them toward the altar. Barbara approached the front row where Carla was sitting. "Oh, I feel so sorry for that old man," she said with feigned sympathy and a sickly French accent. There was a poorly concealed sneer in her voice. She turned to Colin and held out her hand. "Let's go, dear. It's so stuffy in here." Colin stood up. The church was so quiet that you could hear the buzzing of a bee that had accidentally flown in. He didn't look at anyone, not at Carla, not at the priest who was frozen with an open Bible in his hands, not at the farm workers, whose faces expressed a mixture of anger and contempt. He simply took Barbara by the arm and walked toward the exit. They walked down the aisle, she in a flowing white dress, he in an expensive black suit. The train of her dress dragged across the floor, catching on the pews. No one said a word, but the air in the church seemed to ring with tension. Carla sat upright, motionless. Her face expressed nothing, no pain, no anger, no surprise. Only her fingers clenched around the prayer book were white with tension. Old Jim, sitting behind her, gently touched her shoulder, a silent gesture of support. When the church door closed behind the departing couple, Reverend Anderson cleared his throat and continued the service. But the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. This was no longer just a funeral. It was a moment when the entire community had witnessed a betrayal so shameless that it bordered on blasphemy. After the service, during the memorial meal at the community center, no one mentioned what had happened directly, but everyone felt it was their duty to approach Carla, say a few words of support, show her she wasn't alone. The workers' wives bustled around the tables with food, while the men gathered in small groups, talking quietly. Bill Henderson, the owner of a neighboring farm, announced loudly that he was ready to help with anything that was needed. Other farmers supported him. The local banker, Mr. Patterson, took Carla aside and assured her that all the farm's loans would remain on the same terms. "We know that the Swift farm is in good hands." The workers approached Carla one by one. No one said much, but every glance, every handshake conveyed their support. "We're with you, Miss Carla," said young Tim, who had recently joined the farm. "Just tell us what you need." The others nodded in agreement. The women surrounded her with an invisible but reliable protective barrier. Mrs. O'Brien, the chief veterinarian's wife, brought a fresh pie. "You need to eat, dear." Sarah Johnson simply sat down next to her and took her hand. Melanie, old Jim's daughter, quietly organized everything. She made sure everyone had enough food and drink, answered the phone, and wrote down who brought what. By evening, when most of the guests had left, the wives of the workers gathered in the community center kitchen. They washed dishes, arranged chairs, tidied up, and talked. About how Ebenezer built the farm, about how Carla grew up before their eyes, about what a disgrace it was to show up at a funeral in a wedding dress. "French woman, huh?" Mrs. Johnson snorted, vigorously scrubbing a baking sheet. "She's probably never even been to Paris. I've seen women like her, all dresses and perfume, but nothing in their heads." The others nodded in agreement, but no one spoke ill aloud. It wasn't the day for it. Late in the evening, when Carla finally returned home, people were waiting for her at the porch. Several families of workers had decided without consulting each other to stay the night at the house. "You never know," explained old Jim. "It's not right for a woman to be alone on a day like this." Carla didn't object. At that moment, she really didn't want to be alone. Her bedroom windows looked out onto the northern pasture, the very place where her great-grandfather had plowed the first furrow. In the moonlight, she could make out the silhouettes of grazing cows, dark spots on the silvery grass. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the hum of a diesel generator. The farm was going about its usual nighttime business, despite everything. Meanwhile, a luxury car was speeding down the highway to Austin. A white wedding dress lay carelessly thrown on the back seat. Barbara smiled contentedly as she applied lipstick, looking in the rearview mirror. Colin drove, his hands clenched on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. They didn't talk. Everything had already been said and done. Nothing had changed in Ebenezer's office since the day he last left. Carla sat in his chair, sorting through papers in an old secretary desk. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just trying to feel her grandfather's presence, to understand what to do next. She found the gold coins by accident. In the bottom drawer of the desk, she discovered a hidden panel. Carla had bumped into it while clearing out old receipts. Behind the panel was a small tin box that had once held Dutch mill cookies. They used to bake them in the city back in the 50s. The box contained coins, old, heavy, with barely discernible profiles of long-dead rulers, Spanish doubloons, French louis d'or, English sovereigns, a small treasure trove collected by several generations of the Swift family. Carla had known this story since childhood. Her great-great-grandfather, one of the first settlers in these parts, had started collecting gold coins even before the Civil War, not out of greed, but out of caution. "Paper money comes and goes," he used to say, "but gold is always gold." Each generation added something to the collection. Carla's grandfather told her how his father had traded several coins with a traveling merchant during the Great Depression. The merchant didn't know the true value of the old gold. Ebenezer himself added a couple of rare pieces he bought from a coin dealer in the 60s. The coins were never just money. They were family history, the material embodiment of the labor and perseverance of several generations. Each coin had its own story. Grandpa remembered them all and sometimes told his granddaughter about them on long winter evenings. Some coins were especially valuable, not so much for their gold content as for their rarity. 3 Spanish doubloons from the time of Charles IV, with a barely noticeable minting defect, were the pride of the collection. Ebenezer said that there were only a few such coins left in the world. Carla carefully picked up one of the coins. The gold was warm, as if alive. She remembered how her grandfather had shown her these coins when she was a child. He wouldn't let her touch them, but he allowed her to look at them. "This isn't just money," he said. "It's a memory of those who came before us, who built this farm, who believed in the future." The collection was well known among the locals, not in detail, but everyone knew that the Swifts had some old coins. Ebenezer never hid their existence, but he didn't show them off either. For him, They were a family heirloom to be preserved and passed on. Carla sorted through the coins, and a plan gradually formed in her mind. It wasn't evil or vengeful, just fair as she saw it. She remembered how Colin had once taken an interest in the coins, not their history, but their value. She remembered the look on his face when her grandfather mentioned how much rare specimens could be worth. 3 doubloons lay in her palm, heavy with old sorrow and new determination. Carla knew every scratch on their surface, every feature of the minting. She remembered how her grandfather had explained to her why these coins were particularly valuable to collectors. She rose from the table and walked to the window. Beyond the glass lay the farm, her farm now. Somewhere out there in the city, Colin and Barbara were probably making plans for their new life. Well, she could make plans too. After all, she was the granddaughter of Ebenezer Swift, a man who never did anything halfway. Carla carefully wrapped the 3 coins in soft suede. She put the rest of the collection back in the box and hid it in another place. She had her own hiding places in this old house. Then she sat down at her grandfather's desk and began to write a statement to the police. Her handwriting was firm, the words falling confidently and clearly onto the paper. No hysterics, no accusations, just the facts. About the collection of antique coins, their historical value, and how the 3 most valuable pieces had disappeared after her grandfather's death. When she finished writing, she reread the statement. Everything was stated clearly and to the point, just as her grandfather had taught her. Never act in the heat of the moment, he used to say. A good plan is one that you can think through calmly from start to finish. In the evening, she sat on the porch for a long time, watching the sunset. Somewhere in the house, an old clock was ticking, the same one that had kept time for several generations of Swifts. Carla thought about her grandfather, about his lessons, about how he had taught her to be strong. Sometimes, he had said, you have to take justice into your own hands. The cows were mooing in the barn. It was time for the evening milking. Carla stood up and straightened her shoulders. She had a farm to preserve. There were people who believed in her, and she had a plan, simple and clear like all Swift plans. In the pocket of her work jacket lay coins wrapped in suede, silent witnesses to history that would soon play their part in a new chapter of that history. Carla stepped off the porch and walked toward the cowshed. Work would wait, no matter what happened in life. The Austin police station was empty and cool. The sergeant on duty, who had known the Swifts since he helped her grandfather deal with cattle theft attempts, greeted Carla like an old friend. He listened attentively, shaking his head, and wrote down her statement. He was particularly interested in the detailed description of the coins. Carla remembered every feature of the doubloons, every mark left by time. "So you're saying that these 3 coins are missing? The most valuable ones?" the sergeant asked. Carla nodded. She didn't make any direct accusations, just stated the facts, as her grandfather had taught her. The statement was perfectly worded. No hysterics, just precise details and descriptions. They were waiting for her at the farm. Old Jim said that Colin had called and was coming to pick up his things. Carla nodded. She knew this would happen. The workers glanced at each other. No one wanted to leave the lady alone at a time like this, but they all understood that it wasn't their place to intrude. Colin showed up after lunch. His new Lexus looked out of place among the workers' dusty pickup trucks. He got out of the car in an expensive suit and looked around as if he were seeing the farm for the first time. His gait and expression betrayed the poorly concealed superiority of a man who believed he had escaped the backwoods and entered the big world. The workers turned away pointedly as he walked by. Young Tim spat into the dust, completely by accident, of course, just as Colin was passing by. Mechanic Bobby fiddled with the tractor with exaggerated attention, even though everyone knew the machine was in perfect working order. Colin pretended not to notice this silent contempt. He climbed the steps, nodded to Carla as if she were a casual acquaintance rather than the woman he had lived with for several years. "I'm just picking up my things," he said in a tone that suggested he was doing her a favor by taking them. Carla silently pointed to his suitcases, already packed and standing in the hallway. She didn't wait for him to get ready. She just folded all his clothes herself, neatly and methodically. Colin began checking the contents, and it looked almost comical. A man in an expensive suit rummaging through his shirts and socks. While Colin was checking the suitcases in the hallway, Carla pretended to be busy with some papers on the table. Old Jim happened to be standing by the front door, leaning against the door frame. He watched Colin with a heavy gaze, which made Colin nervous, and he began to fold his things hastily and carelessly. While Colin was distracted, checking his jacket pockets, Carla quietly approached the suitcase, pretending to straighten something that had slipped out of place. The coins slid under the lining, where they couldn't be seen by accident. "They say some things find their own way home," Jim said quietly, looking out the window. "Especially things that belong to the earth," Carla replied, returning to the table. They understood each other without words, like people who had lived on the same land for many years. Half an hour later, Colin was finishing loading his things into the trunk. He tried to act confident, but his nervous movements and the way he frantically checked his pockets and zipped up his jacket gave him away. "I'll send the divorce papers through my lawyer," he said as he got into the car. Carla said nothing. She had nothing to say to this stranger in an expensive suit. Jim spat into the dust, this time quite deliberately. The car pulled away, raising a cloud of dust. Colin didn't even look in the rearview mirror, rushing to get away as if afraid that the past might catch up with him. Carla and Jim stood on the porch, watching the Lexus disappear around the corner. "There's going to be a storm," Jim said, sniffing the wind. "Yes," Carla replied, "it looks like it." They weren't talking about the weather, and they both knew it. Somewhere in the suitcase, under the lining of expensive leather, 3 old coins were beginning their journey to a place where justice awaited them. The lawyer's office smelled of coffee and old paper. Mr. Peterson, a local attorney who had known the Swifts since Carla's father's time, laid out documents on the mahogany desk. His assistant moved silently around the office, arranging folders and filing papers. Colin had arrived with his lawyer from Austin, a young man in an expensive suit who kept glancing at his watch. Barbara waited in the car. Her presence in the office would have been too much even for her. However, her influence could be felt in every point of Colin's demands. "So, Mr. Evergreen is claiming a share of the business," Mr. Peterson said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "as compensation for his time and effort." The Austin lawyer nodded in agreement, tapping his expensive pen on the table. Carla listened silently. She knew that Colin had no rights to the farm. All the documents had been drawn up by her grandfather to protect the family property. Ebenezer Swift had foreseen many things, although he could hardly have imagined this particular turn of events. "My client is prepared to waive all claims to the jointly acquired property," Mr. Peterson said, "provided that Mr. Evergreen does the same." The Austin lawyer began to object, but Colin unexpectedly agreed. He was in a hurry to get the formalities over with. The tickets to France had already been purchased. Outside the law office window, the small town bustled with activity. Trucks carrying feed, farmers' pickup trucks, and local residents' cars drove by. Life went on as usual, oblivious to the papers being signed in the cool office, severing ties that once seemed unbreakable. During a break between signing documents, Colin went out to make a phone call. Through the window, he could be seen standing by his car, talking animatedly with Barbara. She was laughing constantly, throwing her head back, clearly imagining her future life in Paris. Mr. Peterson took the opportunity to pour Carla a cup of coffee. "You know," he said quietly, "your grandfather would be proud of you. You're holding up well." Carla just nodded. Words were unnecessary. The old lawyer had known her since she was a child and understood more than he let on. When all the documents were signed, Colin hurried to leave. He paused at the door for a moment as if he wanted to say something but changed his mind. Maybe he wanted to apologize. Maybe he wanted to explain something. Or maybe he just wanted to make sure that it was really over. That evening, the only thing people in town were talking about was that Colin and Barbara were buying tickets to Paris. In a small travel agency on the main street, Barbara was loudly discussing hotels and restaurants with the agent, pronouncing the French names with an exaggerated accent. Colin stood nearby, smiling like a man who had finally gotten everything he wanted. They were planning a big trip, first to Paris, then to the south of France, where Barbara's family supposedly lived. She told everyone about the family chateau, the vineyards, and the ancient traditions. Colin listened to these stories with the enthusiasm of someone who had never been abroad and believed every word. In the city cafe where they had lunch, Barbara entertained Colin with stories about the life that awaited them. The waitress who brought them coffee overheard snippets of their conversation about fashion boutiques, art galleries, and social gatherings. Colin hung on every word as if trying to forget his past life as quickly as possible. They booked a room at an expensive hotel in Paris. Barbara insisted it had to be the Ritz. "First impressions are so important," she said, flipping through glossy brochures. Colin didn't argue. He had stopped arguing with her altogether, trusting her taste and experience completely. In Austin's shops, Barbara bought expensive clothes. You can't show up in Paris dressed like a Texas farmer. Colin obediently paid the bills without batting an eyelid at the prices. His credit card was maxed out from purchases of suits, shirts, and shoes. Barbara chose everything herself, transforming Colin into the man she wanted to see by her side. They made grandiose plans. Barbara talked about her family's connections in the wine business, about investment opportunities, about prospects in international trade. Colin listened, nodded, and dreamed of a life without the smell of silage and mooing cows, where there was no need to get up before dawn and fiddle with machinery, where everything was beautiful, refined, and respectable. In the hotel bar where they celebrated the end of their divorce proceedings, Barbara talked about her mansion in the suburbs of Bordeaux. She got so carried away that she began to get confused about the details. She talked about 3 floors, then 2, then remembered a greenhouse that didn't exist. But Colin didn't notice these inconsistencies. He was too caught up in his dream of a new life. They planned to fly out in a week. Barbara insisted on flying business class. "You have to get used to a certain standard." Colin agreed, even though it meant a serious dent in his savings. However, he was sure that all these expenses would pay off when they started their new life in France. In the last few days before their departure, they hardly showed up in the small town near the farm. They spent their time in Austin, in expensive restaurants and shops. Barbara taught Colin how to pronounce French words correctly and told him about etiquette and the rules of behavior in high society. He picked everything up quickly, trying to get rid of any traces of his farming past as soon as possible. In the evenings, they sat in the bar of an expensive hotel, drinking French wine and making plans. Barbara told him about the parties they would throw, the people they would meet, and the life of refined pleasures that awaited them. Colin listened, and his eyes lit up with that special sparkle that people have when they believe in a beautiful fairy tale. Barbara Jean stood in front of the mirror in her hotel room, scrutinizing her reflection. No, this blouse was definitely not suitable for arriving in Paris. Too simple, too American. She casually tossed the blouse onto the growing pile of clothes she was going to give to the maid. Colin had gone to the bank. Something about a money transfer and international accounts. Barbara didn't bother with such details. She was more concerned about whether she would have time to make an appointment with her hairdresser before her flight. She would have her own stylist in Paris, of course, but first impressions were so important. She leafed through a glossy magazine looking at pictures of mansions in the suburbs of Paris. Somewhere among those luxurious houses, she and Colin would find their place. Barbara imagined how she would receive guests in an elegant living room. She would have to order the right furniture right away. Americans had no sense of style. The phone rang, a message from her cousin Marie. "Are you sure about this American?" Barbara grimaced. Marie had always been a bore. She was always doubting, always asking awkward questions. So what if she had exaggerated the size of the family home in Bordeaux a little? Colin, on the other hand, was so manageable. The maid knocked on the door, bringing the champagne they had ordered. Barbara took her lipstick out of her purse. You couldn't drink champagne with unpainted lips. It was simply indecent. She carefully painted her lips, missing only slightly. Never mind, she would have a professional makeup artist in Paris. Colin returned from the bank looking preoccupied. He said something about exchange rates and transfer restrictions. Barbara didn't listen. She was busy compiling a list of restaurants they absolutely had to visit during their first week. She had read somewhere that you had to book a table at Maxim's a month in advance. She must remember to remind Colin. The suitcases were filling up with new clothes. Barbara insisted on completely revamping her wardrobe. "You can't look like a Texan in Paris," she repeated, making Colin try on another suit. The salespeople in the stores looked at her with poorly concealed skepticism when she talked about French fashion. But who cared? In a few days she would be in Paris. That evening they dined at the best restaurant in Austin. Barbara talked loudly about her family estate, getting confused about the details but making up for it with her enthusiasm. The waiter brought the wine list and she took a long time choosing a wine, pronouncing the names with such an accent that the French wouldn't have understood a word. Barbara couldn't sleep that night, imagining how they would stroll along the Champs-Élysées, sit in street cafes and browse boutiques. She could already see herself in an elegant couture dress with a small dog in her arms. I wonder what breed to choose. I'll have to ask the concierge at the Ritz for advice. In the morning, she sent Colin out to buy new suitcases. The old ones didn't seem fancy enough to her. "Louis Vuitton or nothing," she declared categorically. She stayed in the room, leafing through magazines and imagining how she would decorate their future Parisian home. Maybe she should hire a designer? A real French one, of course. Her passport with a brand new visa lay on the nightstand. Barbara checked periodically to make sure it was still there. Sometimes it seemed like it was all a dream, that she was about to wake up in her small apartment in the suburbs of Lyon, where she had lived her entire life before coming to America. But no, it was all real. The tickets were paid for, the hotel was booked, and the suitcases were almost packed. She was making a list of social events they absolutely had to attend. Exhibitions, premieres, charity evenings, everything she had read about in glossy magazines. She wasn't bothered by the fact that she didn't have any invitations. Such trifles could always be sorted out. The main thing was to dress appropriately and behave confidently. Before going to bed, Barbara took out her wedding dress, the very one she had worn to the funeral. A wine stain on the hem spoiled the impression a little, but she decided it was a sign that she would have to buy a new dress in Paris, maybe even from Dior himself. Colin wouldn't be able to refuse. He never refused. Austin International Airport buzzed with its usual hustle and bustle. Barbara darted between duty-free shops, trying on sunglasses and perfumes. Colin methodically checked their documents, passports, tickets, hotel reservations. Their luggage had already been checked in. 6 brand-new Louis Vuitton suitcases filled with clothes and dreams of a new life. "Monsieur Colin, do you think they serve champagne on the plane?" Barbara hung on his arm, waving her new sunglasses. "In business class, of course," he replied absently, checking the documents again. Something was bothering him, but he couldn't figure out what it was. They were stopped at passport control. The officer looked at their documents for too long, then looked up at Colin. "One moment, sir." He picked up the phone and spoke quietly. Barbara tapped her foot impatiently on the floor. "Mr. Evergreen?" Two customs officers appeared out of nowhere. "Please come with us. We have some questions about your luggage." "What do you mean, questions?" Barbara interrupted. "Our plane leaves in 2 hours. We'll be late for Paris." The customs officers politely but firmly asked them to follow them. The small office smelled of coffee and government furniture. Their passports and some documents were lying on the table. The senior customs officer, a gray-haired man with a tired face, sat down opposite them. "Mr. Evergreen, during the inspection of your luggage, items of historical value were found." He placed a transparent evidence bag on the table. Inside, 3 gold coins glinted dimly. "What is this?" Colin leaned forward. "Spanish doubloons from the time of Charles IV," the customs officer replied calmly. "Very rare specimens. They have a characteristic minting defect." "What coins?" Barbara squealed. "This is some kind of mistake. We're just flying to Paris." "We have a report that these coins were stolen," the customs officer said, pulling out another document. "And an expert opinion on their historical value. Exporting such items without special permission is a criminal offense." Colin was silent. He looked at the coins and remembered the day he picked up the things from the farm. Carla, adjusting something in her suitcase. Jim, leaning against the door frame. Their strange conversation about things that find their way home. "This is ridiculous!" Barbara jumped up. "We're decent people. We have a room booked at the Ritz. I demand a lawyer. Je demande un avocat." 2 police officers entered the office. The detective, who introduced himself as John Myers, placed a document in front of Colin. "This is your arrest warrant, Mr. Evergreen. You have the right to remain silent." "It's all her, isn't it?" Barbara suddenly exclaimed. "That farmer's wife? Did she set this up?" No one answered. The police officers politely but firmly lifted Colin from his chair. It was cool in the station. Barbara sat in the hallway smearing mascara across her cheeks. Colin answered the investigators' questions mechanically, as if in a dream. "When was the last time you were at the Swift farm?" "A week ago. I was picking up some things." "Did you know about these coins?" "Yes. They're part of a family collection." "Did you try to steal them?" "No, I didn't know they were in my luggage." The insurance expert called in to appraise the coins examined them at length through a magnifying glass. "Stunning specimens," he muttered. "There are only a few like these in the world. Their value, I can't even begin to put a figure on it." The lawyer assigned to Colin looked through the documents in the case. Everything was in order. The theft report, the expert opinion, the report on the discovery of the coins in the luggage. There were no leads for the defense. Barb was released a few hours later. She didn't even look at Colin, just stood up and left, her heels clicking on the tiled floor. In her purse were tickets to Paris, but she knew she wasn't going anywhere. Colin was transferred to a detention center pending formal charges. The cell was small and featureless. No hint of the Parisian chic he had dreamed of that morning. Late in the evening, in the almost empty station, Detective Myers poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down on the edge of Sergeant Patterson's desk, the same sergeant who had taken Carla's statement a week ago. "You know," the sergeant said quietly, "Old Swift always said his granddaughter would go far." The detective just grunted in response. "Clean work. Not a fly could get in." They were silent, staring at the case file. Both knew they had witnessed a perfectly planned revenge, but it was impossible to prove. And did they need to? Ebenezer's office remained untouched. Carla had moved his papers to the next room. Sometimes she would go in there, sit down in the old leather chair, and breathe in the familiar smell of wood, tobacco, and leather. At moments like these, she felt as if her grandfather was about to walk in, nod, and ask how things were going. There was always plenty to do on the farm. Carla worked just as she had before, getting up before dawn, checking the cow sheds, monitoring milk yields, and keeping records. Nothing had changed in her management methods. She simply continued to do what she had learned over the years. Miss Carla is just like Mr. Swift, the workers would say. She's the same. She sees everything. She knows everything. They respected her not because she was the boss, but because she really knew every corner of the farm, understood every process, and could replace any worker if necessary. Only Pete Henderson, the new mechanic, once tried to challenge her decision to repair the feed distributor. Maybe it would be easier to buy a new one, he suggested. We don't do that here, Carla snapped. Equipment should be repaired as long as it can be repaired. Old Jim, overhearing the conversation, took Pete aside. No one knew what they talked about, but Pete never questioned the boss's decisions again. However, he quit a month later. He didn't fit in, as Jim put it. In the evenings, when the main work was done, Carla would walk around the farm. It was her grandfather's habit, a final check before bed. She checked the locks, looked in on the cows, and listened to the nighttime sounds of the farm. Sometimes she thought she could hear her grandfather's footsteps behind her, heavy and steady. The workers missed the old man, too. It showed in little things. Some would turn around out of habit when they heard the office door open. Others would automatically save his seat at the table during lunch. Jim still made 2 cups of coffee in the morning, out of old habit, but life went on. The cows needed tending, the land needed working, the equipment needed repairing. Carla managed everything with the same unhurried thoroughness as her grandfather. She didn't try to change or improve anything. The farm ran like a well-oiled machine, and her job was to keep that machine running. At meetings, she sat at the head of the table, where her grandfather used to sit. She spoke softly but meaningfully. Her decisions were not discussed. Everyone knew that she did not make them on a whim. As grandfather taught, she would sometimes say, and that was enough. She was respected in the town. When she went to the bank or to suppliers, they spoke to her as an equal. No condescension, no concessions. She was Swift, the mistress of the farm, and that said it all. On her grandfather's birthday, the workers gathered in the dining room. No one gave speeches. They just remembered the old man with kind words. Carla sat at the head of the table, listening to the quiet conversations, looking at the familiar faces. She knew each of these people, their families, their stories, just as her grandfather had known them. "Mr. Swift would be proud of you," Jim said to her once. Carla just nodded. Words weren't necessary. She was simply doing what she had to do, what her grandfather had taught her, what was right for this land and these people. The farm lived its own life, measured, orderly, understandable. Everyone knew their place and their role. Carla was the center of this world, calm, confident, reliable, just like her grandfather. She didn't try to be him, she just was herself. And that, as Ebenezer used to say, was the most important thing. The Austin County Courthouse ran like a well-oiled machine. Colin Evergreen's hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning. The courtroom gradually filled up. The locals didn't want to miss the show. The story of the stolen antique coins and the failed escape to Paris was on everyone's lips. Barbara sat in the back row, wrapped in a silk scarf and trying hard to look indifferent. Her once perfect manicure was bitten, and her designer handbag had lost its luster. She had spent the last few weeks in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. Her money was rapidly dwindling, and all her attempts to contact her relatives in France had predictably come to nothing. Colin looked lost in his once expensive, now rumpled suit. 2 weeks in a detention center had taken their toll. He was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes. His lawyer, a young man from a free legal aid office, nervously shuffled through papers. The prosecutor was brief and to the point. The coins had been found in the defendant's luggage. Their historical value had been confirmed by experts. The fact of theft had been documented. The attempt to illegally export cultural property was obvious. He read the documents in an even voice, glancing at the jury from time to time. Defendant Evergreen, do you admit your guilt? The judge's voice echoed through the quiet courtroom. Colin stood up, leaning on the table. I didn't know about the coins. His voice sounded uncertain. That's not an answer to the question, the judge remarked. No, Your Honor, I do not. Barbara snorted so loudly that several people turned around. She demonstratively took out her powder compact and began to touch up her makeup, but her hands were visibly shaking. Her testimony had been recorded during the investigation. She swore that she knew nothing about the coins and had never even heard of them before. Witnesses took the stand one after another. Customs officers described the procedure for searching and discovering the coins. An expert spoke at length about the historical value of the doubloons. The investigator read out the interrogation reports. All the evidence fit together into a perfect picture of the crime. The defense looked pathetic. Their only argument was, my client didn't know about the coins. But even the lawyer himself didn't sound very convincing. Colin sat with his head down, seemingly not listening to what was going on. His dreams of Paris were crumbling like a house of cards. When the court announced a recess, Barbara rushed out into the hallway. She needed a smoke, a new habit she had picked up after Colin's arrest. At the coffee machine, she bumped into a reporter from the local newspaper. Mademoiselle Zinn, is it true that you were planning? Barbara cut her off with a shrill no comment and ran to the exit, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Her French accent had become noticeably weaker, and gray hairs had appeared in her hair, which she had not had time to dye. After a break, the prosecutor presented financial documents: tickets to Paris, reservations at the Ritz, Colin's credit card statements. Everything pointed to preparations for an escape. The defendant planned to leave the country, taking with her valuables belonging to the Swift family, he concluded. The jury did not deliberate for long. Barbara had time to smoke only one cigarette before they were called back into the courtroom. The verdict was unanimous: guilty. The judge announced the sentence: 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 1 year. Colin accepted the sentence in silence. Only when he was being led away did he turn around, trying to find Barbara with his eyes, but her seat in the back row was already empty. She had rushed out of the courtroom as soon as the sentence was announced, without waiting for the end of the hearing. That evening, at the motel bar, Barbara tried to forget the day. The bartender indifferently wiped glasses while she told anyone who would listen about her chateau in Bordeaux and how she would show everyone. Her French accent grew stronger with each glass of wine. In his cell in the county jail, Colin lay on a narrow cot staring at the ceiling. He thought about the farm, about Carla, about the coins hidden in the lining of his suitcase. Somewhere deep down, he knew that this was the perfect revenge: cold, calculated, and completely legal, just as old Swift had taught him. Carla was studying the documents for the neighboring property, the McCormick's abandoned pig farm. Old Mr. McCormick had died before completing the project, and his heirs were mired in debt and lawsuits. The situation was complicated, but that was where the opportunity lay. Robert Jacobs, a specialist in complex real estate deals, sat across from her in his office, patiently explaining the scheme. A loan secured by part of the operating farm, the purchase of the McCormick's debts, followed by a lease with an option to buy. His long fingers glided over the documents, clearly pointing out the key points. "There's risk," he said in his characteristic low voice, "but it's calculable." His cold gray eyes betrayed his professional interest. He loved a challenge. Carla appreciated his directness, no sugarcoating, just facts and figures. Jacobs appeared at the farm more and more often to clarify details, check documents, or inspect the site. He moved around the farm with a confidence unexpected for a city man, easily stepping over the mud and ignoring the smells. His expensive suit seemed out of place here, but he himself did not. The workers watched him surreptitiously. "He looks just like that actor from the movie," the women whispered. "Only ours is more serious." Jacobs did indeed resemble the famous Danish actor, the same sharp features, the same piercing gaze. But unlike the movie star, he wasn't acting. He was the real thing. At one meeting, Jacobs noticed a mistake in the contractor's calculations. He had tried to inflate the estimate. "Either you correct the figures, or I'll sue your company," he said calmly. It wasn't a threat, just a statement of fact. The contractor turned pale and corrected the estimate. Carla appreciated his professionalism. He was never late, always prepared, and his documents were flawless. When he talked about work, his eyes lit up with a special fire. He loved complex combinations, multi-step deals, and unconventional solutions. Once he stayed late, sorting through another stack of documents. Carla made coffee. She already knew he liked it black, no sugar. They were sitting in her office discussing the details of the deal when he suddenly fell silent and looked at her with a long gaze. Old Jim, who witnessed the scene, smiled under his mustache. The next day, he approached Carla as she was checking the new milking equipment. "You know, girl," he said, lighting his pipe, a habit he had picked up from his grandfather, "that lawyer of yours is a good one. Not like some of them." Carla wanted to argue, to say that Jacobs was just doing his job, but Jim shook his head. "I've been on this farm for 40 years. I know." He blew a ring of smoke. "He looks at the land the way you do. He evaluates it, he judges it, he respects it. He's a city boy, but he gets it." The deal went ahead as planned. Jacobs methodically untangled legal knots, drew up financing plans, and negotiated with banks and contractors. Carla found herself waiting for him to arrive more and more often, listening for the sound of his car pulling up. He never talked about his personal life, only work, only business. But sometimes, when they were sitting over papers, his hand would accidentally touch hers, or he would hold her gaze a little longer than necessary, or he would spend an extra half hour discussing details that could have been settled over the phone. The employees pretended not to notice. But when Jacobs arrived, work on the farm seemed to run especially smoothly. The women tidied up the office with particular care. The men tried not to make noise with the equipment near the windows. Everyone understood that the boss's personal life might be improving. Carla didn't make any plans. After the incident with Colin, she had learned to be cautious. However, something about Jacobs, his directness, his professionalism, his ability to see the essence of things, touched her soul. He was different, a city man, yes. But, as her grandfather had taught her, the most important thing was for a person to be genuine. Colin was released from prison early in the morning. He had been granted a year of parole for good behavior. He had tried to be the perfect prisoner. Barbara didn't meet him. She had long since left for somewhere in the West, taking the rest of his savings with her. Carla knew he would come. It was a small town, everyone knew everything. She met him at the office. He looked older, faded, as if prison had drained all the color from his once well-groomed appearance. A cheap suit bought at a sale made him look like one of those salesmen who go door to door selling vacuum cleaners. "I had to come," he said, looking away. "Why?" Carla asked calmly. He hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe to apologize. Maybe to explain." "Don't bother," she interrupted. "Everything has already been explained and understood." They were silent. Outside the window, the farm was bustling with workers preparing the equipment for the evening milking. Cows mooed in the distance. Familiar, comforting sounds. the very ones he had once tried so hard to escape. "You know," Colin finally said, "I really did love you. Back then, in the beginning." Carla nodded. "I know. It's just that you loved your dreams more." He flinched as if he had been struck. She always knew how to hit the nail on the head. It was their last meeting. They both knew it. Colin turned and walked toward the exit, slumped, lost. Nothing like the confident man who had once taken her heart to the city only to shatter it against a beautiful illusion. A week later, Robert Jacobs arrived at the farm earlier than usual. He walked straight to the workshop where old Jim was tinkering with the tractor. "Mr. James," he began formally, "I'd like to talk to you." Jim looked up from his work in surprise. Jacobs, usually so confident, was clearly nervous. "You see," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "I'd like to ask for your blessing, as the head of the family." Jim almost dropped the wrench. This city lawyer, with his perfect suits and cold confidence, had come to ask for the blessing of an old mechanic. But Jacob's eyes showed absolute seriousness. "I love her," Robert said simply, "and I respect the traditions of this land. You're the closest person to the family. You've known her since she was a child. Your opinion matters." Jim cleared his throat, trying to hide his excitement. For the first time in many years, he didn't know what to say. That evening, when Carla came in to check on the repairs, Jim was still in a state of mild shock. "You know," he said, lighting his pipe, "that Jacobs of yours is a good man. He's right through and through." Carla smiled. She knew that was the highest praise coming from the old mechanic. Robert proposed the next day, without any romantic flourishes, straightforward and honest, just like everything else he did. They stood by the corral where the young calves grazed. "I love you," he said, "and I love this land. Marry me." Carla looked at him, tall, strong, completely sure of his feelings. He didn't promise her Paris or a beautiful life. He offered to share his present with her, work, worries, responsibility. He offered to be by her side in good times and bad, as they say in old vows. The news spread around the farm in an instant. The workers smiled, congratulated each other, and patted each other on the shoulders. The women furtively wiped away tears. Their mistress had finally found happiness. True, real, as strong as the earth itself. Life on the Swift farm went on as usual, full of work, worries, and plans for the future. But now there was something new in that future, the quiet, deep happiness of two people who had found in each other exactly what they were looking for,